There was a recent Discord conversation talking about Dragon Ball and why Dragon Ball is an immortal franchise. And this is obviously specific to Dragon Ball, as there's of course a lot of other series and franchises out there that are immortal. But what exactly is it that makes Dragon Ball an immortal franchise? What is it in Dragon Ball's makeup and DNA just separates it from most other franchises out there that kind of just have their time and essentially die out? And coming from the fact that I'm a YouTuber that's talked about Dragon Ball and I've seen everything from the era that Super wasn't on the air, from when Super was on the air, now Super's off the air, but we have the manga, and Dragon Ball fans seem to be active. Why is this? I feel like the thing that we first have to actually analyze is that the iconic moments in the actual Dragon Ball fights are actually more memorable than the actual fights themselves, and I think it's the actual moments that make the fight instead of whether or not you just thought the fight was good. Kind of like how you just watch like an MMA or like a boxing fight, you watch it and you move on, but it's not unless the fight had something that was in it that really made you want to remember that fight and go back to that fight many years later. And I think that's the interesting thing about 4 key fights that we will analyze. The first is Goku versus Vegeta on planet Earth. Now, the reason why that defined the Saiyan arc is because that was really the first, like, super fight in Dragon Ball Z. And what I mean by a super fight is obviously the characters already knew how to fly by this point, but basically that was like the first fight that really felt like a Dragon Ball Z fight. And if you go back and you watch that fight, and I'll make a video talking about this more in depth on its own in the future, but that fight was really kind of like the blueprint for how other fights proceeded afterwards. You know, where you have 2 super powerful characters that are fighting against each other, and they're really fighting for Saiyan dominance, which also made the fight more interesting too, because you're having 2 Saiyans who are basically the 2 strongest entities of their own respective race. So whoever comes out of this fight is basically the stronger Saiyan, and obviously Vegeta technically beat Goku because, you know, he transformed in that fight, but up until that point, it was really a fight about complete Saiyan domination, which is what made that fight so interesting. And seeing the evolution of aerial combat to the degree that we saw in that fight was never really seen in other Dragon Ball fights prior to that. Yeah, you would see characters fly in the air for certain periods of time, but aerial combat was not that developed in earlier Dragon Ball fights the way that it expanded into seeing Goku versus Vegeta. And with all of those reasons, that's what gave that fight like its own iconic luster. And then when we go on to the next fight of Goku versus Frieza on planet Namek, obviously, I mean, it's like people totally forget that Goku did fight Frieza for several episodes when he was in his base form and using Kaioken. But it's like people totally forget about that and we just think about the Super Saiyan fight. And why is that? It's because the fight that Goku had with Frieza beforehand wasn't as memorable. But what truly made the fight on Namek so interesting was the fact that Goku was fighting against Frieza on a planet that was completely being destroyed. Fighting on a completely destroyed planet where there's a time limit where you know if you take too long to do this, you're all going to die, has a different level of tension, and it has a different level of, I guess you could say, iconicness towards the fight itself, because you know that you have to finish off Frieza in a small amount of time, and you just learned this transformation and you have to use it right there on the get-go without ever really having any experience of it before, when in fact Goku could barely even move before he became a Super Saiyan, and it's kind of like becoming a Super Saiyan like gave him this boost of adrenaline to allow him to keep fighting when in fact he could barely even move before that. And because Krillin died, and Piccolo was injured and Gohan had to leave, and all of those crazy things that happened in such a small amount of time just was so quick. Like, that was the point of the Namek arc where it really felt like the pacing was starting to move up, even though the fight with Goku versus Frieza Super Saiyans obviously dragged on for several more episodes. The pacing definitely improved at that point of the arc as compared to the slower parts of the Namek arc that were taking place before that. And then when we go on to Gohan versus Cell, I feel like the iconicness of that fight there too, guys, is how you have this little kid that's fighting against this literal perfect being, but because he has so much potential, it just doesn't matter. And seeing the fact that Gohan was fighting against Cell with a handicap, I feel like that was the most iconic part of that entire arc, where you have this kid that's trying everything he can, and he doesn't have the most confidence in himself, but his dad was helping him. And the fact that Gohan's doing everything with just one arm, and he's like not fully using his power until the right moment where Vegeta distracts Cell. All of that whole beam clash, seeing like the evolution of beam clashes, where beforehand when we saw it originally with Goku versus Vegeta, that was an iconic beam clash. But the way that Gohan and Cell had it, where it was actually like on the ground, and you know that whoever wins is basically going to die and take the entire planet with them, added a different level of tension towards it, especially as you see Gohan at the end like shooting the Kamehameha into the sky, so it obviously wouldn't blow the planet up. And for all of those reasons, that fight had its own level of iconicness. And then when we move on to the final fight, we have Goku versus Kid Buu. Now I feel what makes Kid Buu such an interesting character, and you know, obviously the majority of us grew up on Z more, so that's why I'm focusing more on Dragon Ball Z's fights. But I think what made the Kid Buu fight so cool was the fact that Goku is using Super Saiyan 3, which is a transformation that uses a lot of energy. But he has to use it if he wants to fight this guy, and he's doing everything he possibly can, and it seems like it's not getting him anywhere because Buu just literally comes back from nothing. All of those reasons hint as to why Dragon Ball is so immortal because of the fights that it had. Now, there's several other points that we're going to go into briefly here, because obviously the meat of the video was to talk about the iconicness of the actual Dragon Ball fights. But now we're actually going to go on to some other things. So we also have the Dragon Ball characters, and the thing is that Dragon Ball is such a huge fandom that there are so many different characters with different personalities and different abilities that it's very easy to fall in love with certain characters and not care much for others. And I think because of that, because there are Gohan fans and Vegeta fans and Goku fans and, you know, Piccolo fans, you know, and there's no such thing as a Goten fan. I had to put that in there because if you're a Goten fan, I mean, what are you really? You know, but you get the point. Like, because there's so many different types of fans and so many different types of characters, the characters themselves give you a reason to want to watch the show, because you just want to see those specific characters that you grew a connection to for whatever reason, your personal personality, or they remind you of somebody. That's the reason why. We've seen these characters develop over so much time that we have an actual connection to them. And I also think it's also the conversations. There are, I mean, you can talk about other animes, you could talk about other shows and stuff, but what makes Dragon Ball so different, ask me about this, I talk about Dragon Ball on here. It's the fact that you can have conversations about it. You can have these weird power scaling fights of, would Super Saiyan 2 Gohan have defeated Super Perfect Cell if he had a completely usable arm? You could ask all these what if scenarios. You can create all of these different types of conversations within the community that keeps the community alive more than the actual show does. And because, I'm gonna say something else here too, because Dragon Ball is inherently a flawed show when it comes to actually having, you know, like plot holes and, you know, things that just don't make sense, where this character looks too young or this character should look older, or so on and so forth. All of that goes into the show itself, where the flaws of Dragon Ball create conversation for people to discuss. If the Dragon Ball alternate timeline was perfectly explained in Dragon Ball, I would not have had to have made an alternate timeline theory. But the reason why I made that theory was because it was flawed. And the actual flaws of Dragon Ball lead to conversations that have people coming back and talking about Dragon Ball forever for many different reasons. And this wouldn't be an accurate video if we totally forgot about one of the most important reasons why Dragon Ball is immortal, and that is nostalgia. Because if you have memories of going home every single day to watch Toonami, or in my case, reading manga chapters every single night because you didn't have Toonami broadcasted where you were living, you're gonna have a connection to this series the younger that you have it. And I think because Dragon Ball has such a huge age spectrum, where like you have people who are in their 20s, and then you have people who are close to their 40s that all basically grew up on Dragon Ball because the show has expanded for so long, I feel like the show is old enough that it has people of so many different ages that keep creating new Dragon Ball fans, and as a result of it, it's very, very, very hard for Dragon Ball to fully get old. Last but not least, I feel like the ultimate primary reason why Dragon Ball is immortal is because of money. Because if the fans are watching it and consuming it, you can make a good buck on it, and if you can make a good buck on it, you're gonna keep bringing it back to keep making more bucks on it. And that's essentially just it right there. So as long as the bank checks keep coming in, I see no way that Dragon Ball is ever gonna die.